It all started with a routine afternoon, until things took an unexpected turn. A man standing up for his rights was approached by an officer who demanded his ID without any clear reason. What happens next is a jaw-dropping showdown that highlights the power of knowing your rights. Tensions rise as the officer, growing increasingly frustrated, pushes harder to assert control. But the man stays calm and firm, refusing to back down without a lawful reason. As the situation escalates, the cracks in the officer's approach start to show, leaving everyone watching wondering how this will end. Will the officer admit defeat, or will things spiral further? Stay tuned to see how this epic encounter unfolds, exposing a misuse of authority and the importance of standing your ground. This is a story you don't want to miss, proof that knowledge truly is power. The man had just stepped out of a local store, minding his own business, when the officer approached. There wasn't any commotion, no obvious reason for concern, yet the officer's tone carried a weight of authority that felt out of place. "I need to see some ID," the cop said, arms crossed and voice firm. But when the man calmly asked, "What's the reason?" the officer hesitated, his confidence faltering for just a moment. This wasn't the first time the man had dealt with a situation like this. He knew his rights, and he wasn't about to hand over his ID without a valid reason. But as he stood his ground, the officer's frustration became more apparent. Onlookers started to gather at a distance, sensing the brewing tension. The situation was heating up, and it was clear one of them would have to back down. But who would it be? The officer's demeanor grew more impatient as the man stood firm, repeating the same question. "Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" Each time, his voice was calm but unwavering, like someone who had been through this kind of encounter before. The officer, clearly not expecting such resistance, tried to assert control, stepping closer and raising his voice slightly. "You're refusing to cooperate." "That's not how this works," he said, his frustration creeping through. From a distance, a couple of bystanders began recording, their phones subtly pointed at the scene. They too were curious about how this would play out. Meanwhile, the man shifted his stance slightly, keeping his hands visible but refusing to budge. He asked again, "What law am I breaking? What's your reasonable suspicion?" The officer paused, his expression unreadable. Was he even sure of the answer, or just buying time? The air was thick with tension, and the crowd seemed to grow more invested with every passing second. The officer's patience was running thin, and it showed. He leaned in closer, his tone sharp now. "If you don't cooperate, we're going to have a problem," he warned, his hand hovering near his radio as if to call for backup. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow breath and calmly replied, "I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm just asking for the law that says I need to show you my ID right now." His voice remained steady, but the tension was undeniable. The crowd grew more interested, murmurs passing between the bystanders as they watched the exchange. A few people held their phones higher, capturing every second. The officer glanced around, clearly aware that the situation was being recorded. Still, he doubled down, saying, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." But it was clear the man wasn't backing down. He stood his ground, waiting for a lawful explanation that never came. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly cracking under the weight of the moment. The standoff had reached its boiling point, and everyone watching could feel that something big was about to happen. Just when it seemed like the officer was about to take the next step, another patrol car pulled up to the scene. A second officer stepped out, observing the tense standoff with a cautious look. The man's eyes shifted briefly to the new arrival, but he remained calm and composed, not letting his guard down. The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in energy. The first officer turned to his colleague and muttered something under his breath, but it was clear from his body language that he was trying to regain control of the situation. The second officer approached slowly, her demeanor more measured. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone neutral but curious. Before the first officer could respond, the man spoke up. "I'm just asking for the legal reason why I need to show my ID," he said, his voice still steady. The second officer paused, glancing between the two. Her expression shifted slightly. Was it doubt? Concern? For a moment, it felt like the balance of power had shifted. But instead of diffusing the situation, her presence seemed to add another layer of unpredictability. The crowd held their breath, wondering if this new development would tip the scales or make things even worse. The second officer raised her hand slightly, signaling the first officer to step back. "Sir," she said to the man, her tone calm but firm, "you're not required to show ID unless there's reasonable suspicion of a crime. Let's keep this civil." The first officer's jaw tightened, and the crowd murmured in surprise. The man nodded and replied, "That's all I was asking for." "Thank you." But just when it seemed like things were settling, the first officer doubled down, blurting out he was acting suspiciously near the store. "That's enough reason." The second officer's expression hardened. "We can't escalate based on vague suspicions," she said sharply. She turned to the man. "You're free to go. Apologies for the inconvenience." As the man started to leave, a bystander shouted, "You're live online, officer." The first officer froze, realizing the entire encounter was already being broadcast. His face flushed with panic as the second officer shot him a look of disbelief. The crowd dispersed, but the tension lingered. The man walked away, victorious, but the moment left a powerful reminder. Accountability has never been easier to demand. As the man walked away, he glanced back at the crowd and gave a small nod to those who had stood by recording. It wasn't about winning or embarrassing the officer. It was about standing up for what was right. The second officer, now visibly frustrated with her colleague, quietly urged him to return to the patrol car. The first officer hesitated, his pride clearly bruised, but he eventually complied. The onlookers slowly dispersed, some still shaking their heads, others sharing clips of the encounter online. The man, now a few blocks away, felt a mix of relief and pride. Encounters like these weren't easy, but they mattered. Moments like this reminded everyone watching that understanding your rights and staying calm could make all the difference. The video of the incident quickly gained traction, sparking conversations about accountability and proper conduct. And for the man, it was another victory in a bigger fight for fairness.